A compassionate encounter. Jake stood alone on the alien planet, his boots crunching against the dry, dusty soil. His mission was clear: gather resources and return home. But the alien world seemed unwelcoming, harsh, and full of dangers that he hadn't expected. The air felt thick and dry, with a strange, almost suffocating heat that never seemed to leave him. His supplies were low, and he knew he had to find food soon or risk starvation. He was miles away from his ship, deep in a part of the planet no one had dared to explore before. The jungle around him was alive with strange noises, sounds that sent shivers down his spine. His eyes scanned the trees, looking for movement. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches hanging low, almost as if they were reaching out to touch him. The ground was covered in thick vines that made each step slow and careful. He moved cautiously, his hand resting on the pulse gun at his side, just in case. He had been here for 3 days, alone, and each day felt longer than the last. The planet was wild and unpredictable, filled with creatures that could kill a man in seconds. The reports he'd read before landing hadn't prepared him for this. His mind wandered as he walked, the fatigue creeping up on him. The thought of returning to his ship and the comfort of a meal seemed impossible. But Jake knew he had to keep moving. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape, Jake noticed something odd ahead of him. There, nestled in the thick underbrush, was a small creature. It was curled up, its eyes closed, and its body seemed weak, almost lifeless. Jake approached slowly, unsure of what he was seeing. The creature looked unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its skin was a mixture of gray and green, with patches of soft fur along its back. Its body was small, no bigger than a large dog, but it had sharp claws and ears that twitched nervously at every sound. Jake's heart softened as he knelt beside it. The creature didn't move, and for a moment, Jake thought it might be dead. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against its small, cold body. To his surprise, the creature's eyes flickered open. They were a deep amber color, and they locked onto Jake's gaze, filled with a mix of confusion and fear. Jake froze, his mind racing. The creature didn't seem dangerous, but he knew better than to assume that. It could be a trick, a way for the planet's predators to lure him in. But something inside him, a feeling he couldn't explain, urged him to stay. The creature looked hungry, and its ribs were clearly visible beneath its skin. Jake thought about the rations in his pack. They were almost gone, but there was enough for one more meal. With a sigh, Jake opened his pack and pulled out a small packet of food. It wasn't much, just dried meat and some nutrient bars, but it was the only thing he had left. He tore open the packet and offered it to the creature. It hesitated for a moment, its amber eyes studying Jake, before it slowly crawled closer. Jake watched in silence as the creature sniffed at the food, and began eating. He smiled to himself. It was a small act, feeding a starving creature, but in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. As the creature ate, Jake kept his distance, watching it carefully. There was a strange connection between them, a silent understanding. The creature seemed to trust him, and that trust made Jake feel oddly protective. The sun was nearly gone, and Jake knew he needed to find shelter for the night. He glanced around, spotting a large tree with thick roots that would provide some cover. Carefully, he picked up the creature, cradling it gently in his arms, and walked toward the tree. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he settled against the tree, the creature curled up in his lap, its breathing steady and calm. Jake looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above him. He had no idea what would happen next. The planet was dangerous, and he was far from home. But for now, he was not alone. For the first time since arriving, he didn't feel so. Lost, the creature was now asleep, its tiny form tucked against him. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to push aside the exhaustion that was weighing on him. He needed to keep going, to finish his mission, but a part of him didn't want to leave the creature. It had been abandoned, alone, and hungry, just like him. He wondered if it felt the same way, if it too had been stranded on this unforgiving world. He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just leave it. Jake stayed awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the jungle around him. The distant howls of predators, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the trees, the eerie silence of the night. But for now, he felt safe. He had a small companion, and that made all the difference. Just before drifting off to sleep, Jake made a promise to the creature. He would protect it, no matter what happened. He had no idea why he felt so strongly about it, but something in his heart told him it was the right thing to do. The night passed slowly, the jungle alive with movement and sounds. Jake slept lightly, his hand resting on the creature in his lap. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jake awoke to the sound of movement. He opened his eyes just in time to see the small creature standing up and looking toward the edge of the clearing. It wasn't alone. From the shadows of the trees, something massive and powerful emerged. The creature's mother, Jake's heart, skipped a beat. The tigress was enormous, her muscles rippling beneath her thick fur. Her eyes were cold and calculating, filled with the instinct of a hunter. And she was staring right at him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The tigress was no mere animal. She was a force of nature. And she was not pleased to see him with her cub. The unexpected return, the air was thick with tension as Jake stared at the massive tigress that had appeared from the shadows. His heart raced as his eyes locked onto hers. The creature was enormous, easily 3 times the size of any terrestrial tiger Jake had seen in his training. Her fur was a dark mix of deep browns and blacks, sleek and powerful. Her eyes glowed, a fierce golden hue, and she stood still, sizing him up as if deciding whether he was a threat or not. Jake instinctively tightened his grip on the pulse gun at his side, though he knew it would be useless against something of this size. He had no real weapon that could stand against the creature in front of him. The tigress's muscles rippled beneath her fur as she shifted her weight, her sharp claws digging into the earth. Her gaze didn't leave him, and for a moment, Jake thought she might charge at any second. But the creature didn't move. She just stood there, watching him. The air felt suffocating, the silence almost deafening. Jake slowly lowered his hand from the pulse gun, realizing that he didn't want to make a sudden move. The last thing he needed was to provoke her. Cub, still weak and small, now stood beside its mother. It looked up at the tigress, then back at Jake. For a brief moment, Jake saw a flash of something in the cub's eyes: recognition, perhaps, or trust. The little creature seemed to step closer to its mother, rubbing its small face against the tigress's powerful leg. She didn't react, her attention still focused entirely on Jake. "Hey there, little one," Jake said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. The cub looked up at him with those big amber eyes, but it didn't move away. It didn't seem scared of him, which made Jake wonder even more about the connection between them. The tigress's gaze shifted between Jake and the cub. Her muscles tensed, and for a brief second, Jake thought she might pounce. But then, something strange happened. The tigress relaxed just a little, her posture softening as she glanced down at her cub, who was still close to Jake. It was as if the tigress was weighing the situation in her mind, deciding whether Jake posed a threat to her cub or if he could be trusted. Jake swallowed hard, trying to make himself appear non-threatening. He didn't want to cause harm, but he had no idea what this powerful creature would do if she felt threatened. He had no plan, no backup. He was on his own. The Tigress finally took a step forward, her large paw moving slowly over the ground. Jake instinctively backed up a step, but kept his eyes locked on hers. She didn't seem interested in attacking, but Jake wasn't foolish enough to think he was safe yet. The cub's small form suddenly stepped forward, brushing against Jake's leg again, this time with a little more confidence. Jake crouched down, careful not to make any sudden movements. The cub seemed to nudge the food he had left by the tree, looking at him curiously as if asking for more. The tigress stood still, watching them both. There was no growl, no snarl, just a steady, almost calm gaze. "Are you really trying to tell me you're hungry again?" Jake asked softly, looking down at the little creature. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. The tigress's golden eyes flickered toward Jake, her focus still unwavering. Then, without warning, she lowered her head toward the cub. The mother seemed to acknowledge something, perhaps approving of Jake's actions. Or maybe she was just calculating the situation in her own way. The cub looked back at Jake, its amber eyes filled with a strange, trusting expression. Without any sign of fear, it took a tentative step toward the small pile of food Jake had left behind. The tigress made no move to stop it. The cub began to eat, though it was clear that it wasn't as hungry as before. Jake watched the mother closely, still feeling a knot in his stomach. Could this strange wild creature really be okay with him feeding its cub? Or was this just some kind of trick? He had no way of knowing. The planet was full of dangers, and it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that the tigress was luring him in for a deadly ambush. But then again, there was something else. Jake could feel it, a strange calmness in the air. Despite the overwhelming size and power of the tigress, something about her presence felt almost patient. She was observing, waiting, not acting out of pure aggression. Jake realized that he hadn't seen a single sign of hostility from her, and that was odd in itself. The cub finished the small portion of food Jake had given it, then turned back to its mother. It walked up to the tigress, nudging her gently with its head. The tigress looked down at the cub, her eyes softening just slightly. For the first time, Jake saw a hint of affection in her gaze. It was as though she was approving of the cub's actions, or even protecting the bond they shared. Jake didn't know how to feel about what he was seeing. Here was this terrifying creature, a predator at the top of the food chain, and yet she wasn't attacking. Instead, she seemed almost maternal. The two creatures shared an unspoken connection, a bond that was beyond what Jake could fully understand. After a moment, the tigress moved, slowly circling around Jake and her cub. She didn't growl, didn't show her teeth. She simply moved with purpose, as if she was testing him, figuring out whether he was a friend or foe. Jake remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on her the entire time. The tigress stopped behind Jake, her powerful presence like a weight pressing down on him. Jake was certain that one wrong move could result in his demise, but he also knew that the tigress wasn't a mindless killer. She was calculating, intelligent. She was a mother, and that made her different from any other predator Jake had encountered in his life. He slowly turned to face her, keeping his body as still as possible. "I'm not a threat," Jake said softly, unsure if she could understand his words. But he knew that his tone, his posture, had to communicate something. The tigress paused, her golden eyes fixed on him for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she began to back away, her massive form fading into the trees. The cub followed, looking back at Jake one last time before disappearing into the jungle. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His body was still tense, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. The Tigress had come so close to attacking, and yet she had chosen to leave. Jake didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection with these creatures. He had fed the cub, and in return, they had spared him. With the creatures gone, Jake leaned against the tree, his heart still pounding in his chest. What now? He had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was clear: this encounter had changed him. It had shown him that not everything on this strange planet was as hostile as it seemed, and maybe, just maybe, the creatures of this world weren't as different from him as he had first thought. The showdown, the air was thick with tension, and Jake could feel it in his bones. The encounter with the Tigress and her cub had left him with more questions than answers. His pulse was still racing as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The creatures hadn't attacked, but he didn't know why. Jake didn't understand alien species, especially one so powerful, so wild. He had no way of knowing whether the Tigress was simply testing him or if something else was at play. He spent the next few hours nervously pacing around his camp, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had almost forgotten about his mission in all the chaos. His supplies were dwindling, and he needed to find his way back to the ship. But every time he thought about leaving, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He was stuck in this strange world with no clear way out, and he felt a strange sense of responsibility for the cub. As the day wore on, Jake tried to gather his thoughts. The sun was starting to set again, and the air was cooling, but there was still an unease in the atmosphere. Jake checked his gear one more time, making sure everything was in place. His instincts were telling him that something was about to happen. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. His heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his pulse gun. The bushes rustled, and for a moment, Jake thought it was the Tigress again. But this time, the movement was faster, sharper, and there was more of it. Something was coming for him. A shadow appeared in the distance, moving quickly through the trees. It was too fast for the cub or the Tigress. Jake squinted, trying to make out what it was. The shape was large, but it didn't have the same slow, powerful presence as the Tigress. It was smaller, more agile, and moving at a pace that suggested it wasn't concerned about being seen. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew he couldn't wait to find out. Without thinking, he grabbed his gun and darted into the shadows behind the tree, hoping to hide from whatever was out there. He wasn't sure whether this was a predator, another creature, or even a trap, but he didn't want to take any chances. His heart raced as he crouched low, holding his breath. He could hear it now, footsteps, rapid and deliberate. Whatever it was close. Too close. Then it emerged. It wasn't another wild animal, as Jake had feared. It was the cub, but this time, there was something different about it. The cub was moving faster than before, its small body agile and almost graceful. It darted toward him with an energy Jake hadn't seen before. And behind it, just a few steps away, was the Tigress. But this time, she wasn't as calm as before. Her eyes were sharp, narrowed in on Jake. She was coming toward him. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the cub was leading its mother directly to him. The Tigress wasn't moving cautiously now. She was moving with intent, her muscles tensed and ready. The cub, having learned from its mother, was now far more confident, no longer the weak and helpless creature Jake had fed. It seemed to be guiding the Tigress toward him, perhaps signaling that Jake was not an enemy. Jake's mind raced. What should he do? Should he try to run? Fight? He had no idea what the Tigress would do next. He'd never seen a creature this powerful, this wild. He wasn't sure if he could outrun her or if his gun would even make a difference. The cub stopped just a few feet away from him, its amber eyes locking onto Jake's. It seemed calm, almost expectant, as if it knew something. Jake didn't. And then the tigress stopped too, standing tall and proud behind her cub. Her golden eyes flicked toward the small creature at her side, and Jake could feel the weight of her gaze. For a moment, everything was still. There was no growl, no roar, no threat, just the quiet of the jungle surrounding them. Jake held his breath, not daring to make a move. The tigress was waiting, studying him, deciding what to do next. Was she going to attack, or had something changed between them? Slowly, cautiously, Jake lowered his pulse gun, unsure of what to expect. The tigress didn't react, but her eyes never left him. The cub, on the other hand, seemed to relax, its little body not as tense as before. It nudged the tigress's leg, almost as if asking for reassurance. The tigress lowered her head slightly, her gaze softening just a touch. It wasn't a sign of submission, Jake realized. It was a sign of understanding. The tigress, despite her ferocity, was not a mindless killer. She was calculating, intelligent, and in some way, she was trying to communicate with him. The cub had taught her something. It was as if the tigress knew Jake wasn't a threat anymore. Jake took a cautious step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to fight." The tigress's golden eyes flicked to him for a moment, before returning to her cub. There was a long silence, but this time it wasn't tense. It was the kind of silence that came before something important happened. The tigress did something that shocked Jake. She stepped aside, her massive body moving effortlessly, as if giving him space. She wasn't retreating, but she wasn't advancing either. She was letting him make the next move. The cub, still close to its mother, glanced at Jake one last time before looking up at the Tigress. Jake stood still, not sure what to do. He didn't want to provoke her, but he couldn't just leave. The bond he had formed with the cub and even the tigress was something he couldn't ignore. He had shared a moment of connection with them, something that no one else would ever understand. These creatures weren't just beasts of the jungle. They were intelligent, capable of forming bonds. They had shown him trust, and he was willing to do the same. Without taking his eyes off the tigress, Jake crouched down. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his food. It wasn't much, just a small portion of nutrient bars, but it was all he had left. Slowly, he placed the food on the ground between him and the tigress, keeping his movements as calm as possible. The tigress watched him for a long moment, her eyes scanning him carefully. Then, to Jake's amazement, she stepped forward. Her massive paw brushed gently against the food, nudging it closer to the cub. The cub sniffed the food, then looked back up at Jake with a strange look in its eyes, as if it were offering thanks. The tigress, too, seemed to acknowledge his gesture, her body language shifting just slightly to show that she no longer viewed him as an enemy. Jake smiled, a quiet relief flooding through him. He hadn't been sure how this would end, but somehow, it was beginning to feel like there was hope. The cub and the tigress were not just survivors of this harsh world. They were a family. And in a way, Jake had become a part of that family, if only for a brief moment. As the tigress and cub shared the food, Jake stood up slowly, giving them space. He didn't want to push his luck, but he also didn't want to leave without understanding more. There was still so much about this alien world he didn't know. So much that he couldn't comprehend, but for now he had survived. And for the first time since landing on this planet, he didn't feel completely alone. An unexpected alliance. Jake stood motionless, his eyes following the tigress as she watched over her cub. He had never been this close to such a powerful creature before, and the reality of the moment left him in awe. The large tigress, her muscles rippling beneath her thick fur, had not attacked. Instead, she had shown him an unexpected kindness. She had accepted his gesture, sharing the food he had offered her cub without a sign of aggression. For a long moment, Jake didn't know what to think. He had expected the worst, but instead, he found himself in a strange, almost peaceful standoff with one of the most dangerous creatures he had ever seen. He glanced at the cub, who was still nibbling on the food, looking up at Jake now and then with those innocent amber eyes. The tigress wasn't just a predator. She was a mother. Jake could see that now. She was fiercely protective, not only of her cub but of everything she considered hers. And that meant she was unpredictable. Despite everything, Jake realized that he couldn't simply leave. He had made a connection here, whether he liked it or not. He knew he had to get back to his ship, but there was no telling when or how the tigress would react if he tried to leave. What if she attacked him the moment he turned his back? What if the cub got scared and led its mother into a frenzy? Jake couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But still, the bond they had formed, no matter how strange, kept him rooted to the spot. He glanced up at the sky. The sun was slowly sinking, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The jungle around him was alive with sounds, the calls of strange creatures echoing through the trees. But in this small clearing, the world felt calm. The tigress and her cub were no longer threats in Jake's mind. They were simply survivors, just like him. After what felt like an eternity, the tigress turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the jungle around them. Jake followed her gaze, his instincts kicking in. Something was off. There was a faint sound, like the rustling of leaves, growing closer. It wasn't an animal, no. This was something else. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He felt a surge of adrenaline, his body tensing in response. His first thought was that it was another predator, something even more dangerous than the tigress. But then, just as quickly, he realized that the tigress was not moving in alarm. She was still, watching the trees carefully, her ears flicking as she listened. The cub, sensing its mother's alertness, stopped eating and looked up, its body tensing. Jake stayed still, trying not to draw attention to himself. He slowly reached for his pulse gun, keeping his eyes locked on the tigress. She seemed to be waiting for something. But what? Had she sensed danger? Suddenly, the rustling grew louder, and then out of the shadows stepped another creature. It wasn't another predator, though. It wasn't anything Jake had expected. It was another cub. This one was larger than the first, its fur a mix of browns and blacks. It had a slightly more aggressive posture, its teeth showing as it bared them in what seemed like a challenge. Jake's heart raced. Another cub? He thought the tigress had only one. But this new cub wasn't the same. There was a fierceness in its eyes, a fire that was unmistakable. The tigress didn't move at first, but Jake could see the shift in her demeanor. She wasn't angry, but she was definitely on alert. The two cubs locked eyes for a moment. The smaller cub, the one Jake had fed, looked at the new cub with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. Jake wasn't sure what to do. This was an unexpected development. Was this new cub part of the tigress's family, or was it an intruder? Was it hostile? The tigress finally stepped forward, her large body blocking her cub from the other one. She didn't snarl or growl, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The new cub seemed to test the tigress, taking a step forward. Its eyes were locked on the smaller cub, and Jake could see the way its muscles tensed. There was a silent standoff between the two cubs. Jake's mind raced. Should he intervene? He couldn't risk angering the tigress by stepping in, but he didn't want to see the smaller cub hurt. He wasn't sure why, but he felt responsible for it. It had trusted him, after all. The tigress growled low, a warning to the larger cub. She wasn't just a mother protecting her young. She was a leader, asserting dominance in her territory. But the new cub wasn't backing down. It was wild, untamed, and hungry for a fight. Jake could see it in its eyes. This wasn't just a playful dispute. This was a battle for position, for dominance. The smaller cub took a step back, its eyes wide with fear. Jake could see the tension in its body, its tiny form trembling slightly. But then, without warning, the tigress lunged. She was too fast for Jake to react in time. The larger cub was taken by surprise as the tigress knocked it to the ground with a powerful swipe. Jake felt his heart race as he watched the two cubs tumble to the ground. The larger cub growled, its sharp claws swiping at the tigress's side. But the tigress was in complete control. She moved with the precision of a seasoned predator, using her size and strength to subdue the larger cub. Jake couldn't move. He was frozen, watching in awe as the tigress fought to protect her cub. The fight wasn't just about power, it was about survival. And in this world, only the strong survived. The larger cub finally gave in, its body going limp beneath the tigress. She stepped back, her golden eyes watching the defeated cub carefully. For a moment, there was silence. The smaller cub, still nervous, crept closer to its mother. The tigress didn't move, but her eyes softened, and she lowered her head slightly, nuzzling her cub. Jake exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The battle had been swift, brutal, but over in seconds. The larger cub, though, still alive, had been subdued. It limped off into the jungle, clearly defeated. The tigress didn't pursue it. She had made her point. Jake felt a mix of relief and confusion. What had just happened? Why had the larger cub attacked? And what did this mean for him? The tigress turned back to Jake, her golden eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. This time, there was no aggression in her gaze. There was only a quiet understanding, a silent acknowledgement that the battle was over. Jake, still in shock from the fight, didn't know what to say. But in that moment, he realized that he had been part of something far bigger than himself. The tigress had shown him her strength, her ability to protect, to lead. And in return, Jake had shown her that he wasn't a threat. The bond between them had grown stronger. They weren't just two strangers in a dangerous world anymore. They were allies, even if only for a moment. The tigress's gift and a new beginning. The jungle around Jake was alive with sound again. But for some reason, everything felt quieter now. The battle between the two cubs had come to an end, and the tigress had won. The larger cub had retreated into the jungle, nursing its wounds. But the tigress wasn't concerned about the fight anymore. Her focus was on her cub, the one that had stayed close by her side, and on Jake, who still stood a few feet away, watching everything unfold. The air was still thick with tension, but now there was something else. A strange sense of peace. Jake slowly moved to stand up, careful not to make any sudden moves. The tigress hadn't shown any signs of aggression since the battle, but he knew better than to assume that meant he was safe. He wasn't sure if the tigress had accepted him, or if she was just biding her time. She was a creature of instinct, a mother protecting her young, and Jake understood that. But he still didn't know what her next move would be. The tigress turned her head to glance at Jake, her golden eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was no movement, no sound, just the silent exchange between the two of them. Jake held her gaze, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to overstep, didn't want to make the tigress feel threatened. But there was something in her eyes that was different now. Something that wasn't just caution or aggression. Then the tigress took a slow step toward him. Jake stood still, his heart racing. Was this the moment when she decided to attack? Would she pounce and end his life in an instant? Or was something else happening? The tigress moved closer, her massive body gliding through the trees with silent grace. Jake couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct told him to run, to get away. But he stayed where he was. He had fed the cub. He had shown kindness. And in return, he hoped that the tigress would see him as something more than a threat. The tigress stopped a few feet away, her large head lowering slightly. Jake noticed the way her eyes softened as she watched him. She wasn't a mindless predator. She was intelligent, calculating, and now it seemed she was searching for something in him. She was trying to understand, trying to decide if he could be trusted. Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. The tigress was so close now that he could see every detail of her. The gleam in her fur, the way her muscles rippled as she moved, and the sharpness of her claws. She was a perfect predator, a machine built for survival. Yet, there was something about her that made Jake feel connected. She wasn't just a killer. She was a mother, a protector. And in some strange way, he felt like they had something in common. The cub, still by its mother's side, looked at Jake with those same amber eyes, studying him intently. It was clear that the cub trusted him, and perhaps that trust was enough to bridge the gap between Jake and the tigress. She had seen her cub approach him without fear, and now she was doing the same. Jake hadn't expected this, but here he was, standing before a creature far more dangerous than any human he had ever encountered. And somehow they were understanding each other without warning. The tigress took another step forward, her body moving with the precision of a trained predator. She was so close now that Jake could feel the heat radiating off her. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm, his body still as stone. And then, just when he thought she would lunge at him, she did something that completely surprised him. The tigress lowered her head, nudging something toward Jake. It was a small object, something shiny and metallic. At first, Jake thought it might be a rock or a piece of debris, but when he looked closer, he realized it was something much more valuable. The object shimmered in the dim light of the jungle, its surface smooth and polished. Jake hesitated, unsure of what to do. Was this a gift or a trick? The tigress had just shown him the depths of her power. She had defeated the larger cub without hesitation, but now she was offering him something. Slowly, cautiously, Jake reached down and picked up the object. It was a small metal disc, no larger than the palm of his hand. It was covered in strange symbols that Jake didn't recognize, but it felt significant. Like it held a power he couldn't comprehend. The tigress didn't make a sound, but she watched him intently, her eyes still filled with that strange, calm understanding. She was waiting for Jake to react. Jake looked from the object in his hand to the tigress, trying to make sense of it. This was no ordinary piece of junk. It was too precise, too carefully made. And in that moment, Jake realized that this was her way of acknowledging their bond. She wasn't just giving him a gift. She was offering him something of value, something that showed her respect, her recognition of what had happened between them. Jake felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding. He had come to this planet expecting to be alone, expecting to fight for his life against creatures he couldn't even begin to understand. But now, here he was, holding something from the tigress, a gift that no one else would ever receive. It was a symbol of something deeper, a connection that went beyond the surface. He looked up at the tigress and nodded slowly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure if she could understand his words. But he hoped she understood the meaning behind them. The tigress watched him for a moment longer, and then, as if satisfied, she turned away. Her cub followed closely behind. looking back at Jake one last time before disappearing into the jungle. The Tigress didn't look back, but Jake knew that this moment would stay with him forever. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something that no human had ever experienced. As the Tigress and cub vanished into the trees, Jake stood there for a moment longer, holding the metal disc in his hand. The jungle around him seemed quieter now, less threatening. The danger hadn't disappeared, but something had changed. Jake felt a strange peace settle over him. He was no longer just a stranger in a hostile world. He had become a part of something much bigger. The gift was more than just a token from the Tigress. It was a symbol of the unexpected alliances that could form, even between species as different as humans and alien predators. Jake's mission had been to survive, but now he realized he had found something far more valuable than just survival. He had found understanding. And in this alien world, that was the most powerful thing of all. Jake turned toward the direction of his ship, the path ahead uncertain. But for the first time since arriving, he felt like he wasn't walking alone.